This video is going to be on how to assemble my Nanowhoop build. Here's all the parts you'll need. You'll need a camera mount. There are two types. There's one that wraps around the camera, and then there's a light mount. The files for this are in the description if you want to print your own. You could also buy one from my Etsy shop, which is also in the description. The same goes for these battery slings. You could also find them alongside the file for this. These are nylon screws. 31mm props from HQ, Beta FPV 5-in-1 flight controller. These are the motors I will be using. I don't recommend these motors. I recommend RC and Power 29,000 kV motors. These are Beta FPV 27,000 kV motors. These are the lightest that you can get, but they also don't give great performance compared to the RC and Power motors. If your goal is to make it as light as possible, then you can go with these. If you want good performance, then go with the RC and Power motors. And if you're a maniac, then you can go with these 40,000 kV motors from WeBleed FPV. I do not recommend these. These are way too overpowered. I literally killed one of my batteries just going full throttle on one of them. And speaking of batteries, if you're gonna be going as fast as possible, then I recommend getting the WeBleed FPV battery. If you just want to cruise around and do some light freestyle, then Beta FPV Lava 260 is a good one. The frame is countersunk for these countersunk screws, so make sure you have it on the right side. Just install the screws and then install the battery sling. For the front battery sling, you want to install it facing the back and then thread this up through the hole. It also comes with these washers. The washers are the same thickness as the battery sling, and the reason for that is if you tighten them down without the washers, then the board is going to be compressed because it's not going to be leveled with the screws. Now you can install the flight controller onto it. I recommend cutting the camera connector and just direct soldering that on, but you can also just use the plug that's on the other side of the controller. Next is the motors. I'm going to temporarily set this motor in place. You can use this to figure out how long the motor connectors are going to be. So just run them to the flight controller. And you want to give it a little bit of slack. So don't cut here, cut right here. That way the motors have some slack. This will help with collisions because if the wires are under tension, then they could just snap. Once you get one measured, then you could just use that to measure all the other ones. Now that all the motors are cut, you want to pinch the wires and take off some of the insulation. You don't even need a wire cutter for this. These wires are very thin. Now you want to twist these wires up. That way they don't fray. These wires are going to be soldered very close together, so if they fray, all it takes is one strand and you can short out the whole flight controller. So you want to just make sure the wires are nice and straight. There's no loose ends. You should use a soldering iron with a flat tip like this. It'll make it easier to solder. I'm using one with a slightly smaller flat tip, that way I could solder down the pads more easily. I don't advise using a conical tip like this one because it's hard to get a good thermal conductivity when you try to solder it down. Just tap the wire with the soldering iron. You don't want a glob of solder to be on the wire. So if that happens, then just go over it once more and it should wick it away. Not all the wires are tinned. You could just start by installing the motors. You don't really need to install all the screws, just enough to get the motor seated in place so you could solder the wires on. Make sure you put these antennas through these holes here. There's one for the VTX antenna and one for the receiver antenna. And also you want to make sure that the power cable is routed up through the frame. Now just run each motor wire to its respective pad. It doesn't really matter which one goes where, because you'll be able to calibrate that later. You don't want anything sticking out too much. You don't want anything contacting the props. If your wires end up being too long, then you could just twist the wires up. These wires are a bit too long, and if that's the case, then you could just take the motor, twist it, and that'll shorten the wires and also make them a little bit more neat. I do like having my wires a bit longer than necessary. That way, if they snap, I could easily just retin the wire. Whereas if they're just at the limit of how much length they have, then once they snap, you gotta rerun an entirely new wire to the motor and to the flight controller. Next is the camera. Like I said, you can attach this to the camera connector, but I prefer to direct solder it. There's two ways you can go about installing the camera. The first one is using this wraparound mount. Just put some double-sided tape on the camera. And then if you're using the connector, you could just install it through here. Make sure that if this is flat, this should be facing up. And then just wrap this around. Run this off to the side. And then just slide this over here. And now the camera is in place. Make sure the camera's facing up and install it here. You'll see these little ears that are on the frame. They'll hook into these notches, and that'll keep the camera in place. That is the first way if you're using the wraparound mount. I do recommend this because it helps protect the camera a little bit more. If you want to be as light as possible, then you could use the light mount. Just put some hot glue on it and attach the camera down. And if you ever want to remove it, just apply some heat to it and it should come off. If it doesn't come off easily, then apply more heat to it. If you try to brute force it, then you might end up ripping off one of these chips on the back of the camera. I'm going to be direct soldering this camera, so I'm just going to install the camera, measure out how much wire I need, and then cut. I like to leave a little excess. That way it makes it easier to adjust things if I need to. The motor wires are soft enough that you could just cut into the insulation with your nail and pull the insulation off, but that's not the same for these camera wires. You're actually going to need a tool to strip them. Just get some wire snips and very carefully cut the insulation off the wire. When you go about doing this, you want to cut it from you want to slowly press down, and you'll feel the difference in resistance from the insulation to the wire itself. Once you start to feel that resistance, back off, change your angle, and then cut from the other side. And then you should be able to just pull it off. Remember, don't use too much pressure or you'll end up just cutting clean through the wire. So just like with the motor wires, you want to twist these up. That way they don't fray. I don't know if you could tell on camera, but I did cut these a little bit longer than necessary. So once I tin these wires, I'll just be cutting them back a little bit. It should be about the same length as the pads that they're going onto. Now that those wires are tinned, I'm going to cut off a little bit. The ends are longer than they need to be. Each of these pads for the camera is labeled. 5-volt is red, ground is black, and whatever's left is cam. I did end up with a little bit of slack on the camera connector, which is perfectly fine. If that happens, just twist the connector up and then set it back down. Ooh, it's upside down. There we go. Next is the props. For the record, this is a different build. I already finished the Nanowhoop build, but I'm just going to be showing you guys how to fix some mistakes if you make any. If you put too much solder on these pads and you need to clean them off, then take a piece of solder wick and just clean the pads off. Before you solder the motor wires on, you just want to tin these pads. Don't go crazy with solder, just a little bit. Just a very little bit. So that build is done, and it actually ended up being quite a bit lighter than the original. Yeah, almost a full gram lighter. But these motors don't have a good performance, so I still don't advise using these motors. I do have a bunch of other drones. Let me know if you're interested in seeing the build video for these.